Welcome everybody to the 73rd Monday live show. Delighted to have Jane Gunn with us today, but just a couple of quick things to remind you of. In my briefing this morning, I talked about conditional bargaining. This is one of the things that most people forget about when they're negotiating. Somebody asks you for something and you forget to make it conditional on getting something in return. The magic words which people forget, and you might want to write this down if you're watching this on YouTube: if you do this for me, then I will do that for you. And you can fill in the blanks. When people ask people for things in negotiations, generally people say something like no problem, and of course no problem is you're giving something inexpensively away, but it might be hugely valuable to the other side without trading it. And I'm sure Jane will talk about this in mediation as well, as she flits from one room to another. Also, I talked about the Brexit negotiations, which are hopefully are coming to a sensible end. There's too much to lose for both sides not to have a deal, but I did think it was pretty stupid of the French negotiator Michel Barnier to say that he was going to teach the Brits a lesson on Twitter or whatever he said it on. So that's a pretty crazy thing to say. Loose talk costs lives. I remember that poster from the Second World War. I know a few people watching this might remember it as well. My mum told me about it actually. But yeah, walls have ears. Don't say things which are go on record, because they may just be played back to you. Now I'd like to introduce Jane Gunn. I've known Jane for over 12 years. Jane is a lawyer. Jane's a mediator. She's an author, and she's a professional speaker. In fact, she was the president of the Professional Speaking Association in 2014, a couple of years after I was, and she did a fantastic job and blew everybody away. I'm really interested in mediation because it's very close to what I do, win-win negotiations, and we often share stories between Jane and I. What I'm really curious about, Jane, is why you called yourself, since we last met, the barefoot mediator.
Yes. So hello everybody. Yeah, the barefoot mediator. This is causing a bit of a stir. Well, it's a lockdown thing. I think we were just talking as people were joining about, you know, what opportunities have come up for us and things we might not have done if we weren't living in a time of COVID. So one of the things that happened for me from March right through till the weather started getting cold is I wasn't wearing any shoes anymore. Haven't worn any shoes for ages. So I was actually mediating a live case with some clients, and just as we were doing some sort of rapport building, I said, well, I'm not wearing any shoes, haven't worn shoes since March, I'm the barefoot mediator. And that term seems to have stuck. So
Can you just stop a minute? I think we've got a lot of noise on the line. Can I ask everybody to mute themselves, or in fact, I might be able to mute everybody, and then I'm going to mute everybody. Jane, would you unmute yourself, please? Right, everybody is muted. Jane, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, that's brilliant. These things happen on Zoom. Apologies for that. And now we're back on. Okay, Jane, thanks.
So when I looked into sort of what barefoot mediator might be, I don't know if many of you may have heard of the Barefoot Doctor, who was around, has written a number of books, and in fact sadly passed away last year, I think. But the term barefoot originally came in the context of doctors from China, and the idea was that in the rural communities, which were so far from the city centres and from hospitals and doctors, to be able to give people medical help, they thought they would train up local people, farmers and so on, people from the rural communities, to be able to give first aid and medical help to people in the communities, so they didn't either have to travel to the doctors and hospitals in the city centres, or that they could be in safe hands until they did. So that was where the term barefoot doctors came from. So for me, exploring this, the barefoot mediator is the same thing. To train people up as barefoot mediators means, what are the skills that I use as a mediator every day in life, and how could you apply those rather than training to be a commercial or a business mediator like I am, are there some of the skills that I use as a mediator that everybody could be learning and applying in their everyday life, whether that's at work or at home or in their families and so on. So that's what the term barefoot mediator is meaning, and I've certainly got some clients interested in training up members of their team as barefoot mediators already. So it's actually taken off and has become a thing. We've got barefoot mediation training starting in January, in actual fact. So watch this space.
Well, that's really interesting. I must admit, I rang Jane when I first saw it and I thought, what a brilliant idea. I wish I'd have thought of the barefoot negotiator, and I'm sure Will Kinchish wished he thought about the barefoot networker. So that's a brilliant idea. And I've always thought the title of your book, Jane, was pretty amazing as well. Bedlam in the boardroom, or boardroom in the bedroom. You've always been quite risky on what you've done on things like that, haven't
Yes.
you? And
Yeah.
it's been great fun and
Yes.
brilliant. What made you think of that title for your book?
So I wrote that book 10 years ago now, and I think at a time when mediation was, we were struggling to get it into the sort of mainstream, and most of the books that were written about mediation were written in a fairly, in the same way that legal textbooks were written, really. How to mediate commercial disputes would be the title, and it would be a plain blue very expensive book published by Sweet Maxwell or something. So I just wanted to write something for the everyday population, and then I was doing a workshop for some chief executives or a board in a company, and when it came to asking me what their problems were, they came up with all these things about the families and their teenagers, and all of this was interfering with their work life. And so I thought, well, there's always an overlap, isn't there, between what's going on at work and what's going on at home. Those of you who've been married for 50 years will know this really well. You can't separate work and home. And I realised it's the same skill set that we use to resolve conflict in both of those contexts. So that's why I wrote the book, How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boredom in the Bedroom. And the title just came to me when I was out on a walk one day.
We've been talking about titles coming to people and ideas coming to people when they're totally relaxed, walking, etc. on holiday. Yeah, totally. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And in fact, it reminds me when I went to the Harvard Business School to study negotiation, their program, which was the executive negotiating program, followed very much the lines of CEDAR. Now, that's CEDR. I can't remember what that stands for, but that's the Association for Mediators, I think, Jane, isn't it?
It's one of them. So mediation started dripping into this country, if you like, in the early 1990s, and by about 1992 or 3, a centre had been set up, the Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution, bringing these principles, as Derek says, from Harvard Business School and from the Harvard Project on Negotiation into the legal framework over here in the UK. And so CEDAR were the first body to set up a mediation training course. There are many now running around the country and in fact around the world, but they were one of the first people to put that into a training for the legal profession. And I was one of the first cohort to go through that training in 1995 and train as a commercial mediator.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I found it very similar because I went and spoke to the chief executive of CEDAR, and I found their training was exactly the same as what I've done, but he still wanted 20,000 Swiss francs for me to go on a course in Switzerland. So I dumped that idea. That didn't seem a very smart idea to do. Let's talk about mediation, because I know that you get involved in some pretty tricky negotiations and you're very skilled at it, but what would you do if you had to negotiate or mediate between Trump and Biden? What would you do?
I've thought about that quite a lot, actually, because obviously they're interesting characters, aren't they? But do you mean in one of their live TV debates, Derek?
Well, I think you'd handle that very well because you'd press the mute button, wouldn't you? But I just thought if you had the two of them in a room throwing things at each other, how you would handle that, because you must have had people almost throwing things.
I have had people throwing things at each other or even going for each other's throats, and I've had to stand in the middle. I think we actually talked about this on the last call I was on. So, of course, people often get very emotional in mediations, and they get very attached to their position. And obviously, politicians are very attached to their position, particularly in the time of an election. It's all about trying to get their position across to the electorate and rubbish the other side's position. And that's how they try and do it. The interesting thing is, as with a lot of marketing, the way politicians try to sell us their position is often counter effective. It isn't as effective as it could be, because instead of appealing to what our base needs and interests would be, they're actually just trying to rubbish the other side, and sometimes that doesn't come across very well, and sometimes obviously the other person scores points against them. So you would know, Derek, from your course at Harvard, that what they're talking about is their position, rather than talking about all the other things that people are interested in underneath. And they're not able, therefore, often to communicate terribly well with their electorate or with communities. And sometimes to us, they don't realise, but they just look like silly school children arguing. And that's why the debates are so ineffective. And it's such a shame that we have debates and not dialogue. And I think, that applies across the board, really. There are so many instances where a dialogue, a conversation about something would be much more effective than having, a debate which is very positional and very much about scoring points and who's right and who's wrong, because politics can never be about who's right and who's wrong, really. But it's always made out to be so. So I don't think that totally answers your question.
Well, I think it was probably a very unfair question, James. So I think I will just mention that in 2 weeks' time, we have the one and only Graham Davis on, because he promised to come on after the election in the USA, and I closed the sale immediately on that, and I booked him for the 9th of November. He's also asked for our friends Tim Durkin from Texas and Patricia Fripp from San Francisco to come on. So I'm in the throes of negotiating with both of those to
wow, you'll definitely be in the hot seat on that one, Derek.
You certainly will, and I couldn't think of a nicer guy in the hot seat with me, because I need to get him back on a few things.
Yeah.
What about Brexit? Would it be fairer to talk about Brexit, because Monsieur Barnier has invited Mr. Frost, our negotiator, to Brussels this week, and there's been lots of brickbats being thrown at each other. If you were trying to mediate that, how would that work?
I think what I see in Brexit, Derek, is what I see in a lot of mediations is, again, it's this positional thing, but people kind of saying this is their last and final offer, and also using what we would call their contingent or their group. So whoever is their group of supporters, they're appealing very much to them or to the press to try and score points by saying this is it, we're off, and Boris Johnson's doing that, this is the last chance, we're walking out. And I get that quite a lot in mediations, where people say this is our last and final offer, and they've actually got their coats on and they're walking out the door and they tell you that's it. And it's a dangerous game to play, because very often they don't mean that. Isn't their last and final offer, it's just what you would say, it's posturing. So it's really trying to threaten, and it's we've been seeing a lot in the press about who's going to blink first, and that's what they're trying to do, is to put the pressure on the other side, and to do that in front of everybody who's watching. So there's obviously a large audience watching all these negotiations. They're not in a private room. I think I would, in many of these cases, I would actually like to take the key players and do what we actually do in a mediation, which is to say, let's sit down behind closed doors without everybody watching, without you playing to the gallery of your supporters, and just talk about what really matters. Because we don't do that yet. They keep firing those salvos off at each other. And what we do in a mediation is we take people away and we sit in a private setting and we just talk it out until it's done, really. And then when they've sorted it out, they can go back out again. But you really take them away from the spotlight and away from trying to appeal to people. Sometimes people have a hotline to their favourite team or whatever, and that's one of the challenges. But that's what you really want to do with people, and it's a bit like doing a Camp David, if you like, and some of the negotiations that have gone on around some big conflicts is you take people to this kind of fireside, let's kick your shoes off, let's relax, let's sit down, and let's really have a proper, as I say, a dialogue about this rather than a debate, and stop posturing and to actually talk about where we're really trying to get to. But
no, that's great, Jane. And of course, with Brexit, Monsieur Barnier will be saying, "Well, I've got 27 people to vote on this contract," which of course he hasn't, has he? He's been he's answering to the French Prime Minister more than anybody else, and Mrs. Merkel's clearly going to step in at this stage. How do you deal with that higher authority negotiating tactic? In fact, it's one of my favourite ones to keep people honest, to go to higher authority. But you just get to the deal, and they say we got to call back to Berlin and just make sure that the key negotiator for the EU, probably Mrs. Merkel, is okay with this, and she can persuade the others.
So this happens a lot in commercial negotiation and mediation, Derek, and often it's a game-playing tactic. So someone will come to the negotiating table and they'll say, yes, I'm happy with that, but of course I've got to check with whoever my higher authority is. And one of the things you have to do is at the very beginning of the meeting, check they've either got that person with them or they've got a hotline to them, because what often they'll say is, oh, sorry about that, we've got to delay until another day now because they've gone home or they're not on the line. So you need to make sure if there is someone, they've got a hotline, and actually that they are within that they have got what we would call authority to settle. So we need to kind of know that they come with a decent amount of authority, and that it's only if they go to an extraordinary level that they've got to make those phone calls, because it can throw the whole thing. If, say, a large organisation like a bank, for example, send a very junior executive who has no authority whatsoever, and they've been sent to this meeting, and then they keep having to ring back and they can't settle something. So it's one of the things you need to be clear about is who's coming to the table at a negotiation, and what level of seniority and authority do they have, and at what stage are they going to need to, and really, the more people who've actually got the authority around the table, rather than them being outside the room and dialing in, the better.
Sure, but that is a tricky one, isn't it? You can imagine how.
And actually, sometimes, but even in commercial mediations, the person outside the room who's driving what's going on is not necessarily a commercial colleague, but could be a family member. So it might be the spouse of the person who's in the room, or the brother. Or in one of my examples, it was his colleagues who'd set up a fighting fund for him and said, don't you dare settle against the management. And they were the ones that'd been meeting in the pub every week, cheering him on. And when he said, yes, that's the deal I want. But when he rang his mates down the pub, they said, don't you dare settle. We've been fighting for you for 6 months and buying your beers. So
Wow. Yeah, no, I was just, that's the biggest issue, I guess, isn't it, of the whole lot. Now, let's turn to, we talked about COVID, didn't we? And I want to know, you told me we got one or two people from up north who were locked down. You told me you ran a role play with masks, about masks, negotiating with masks last week, didn't you?
Yeah, so live workshop, an online workshop I was running last week with some colleagues from up north. So what we did was we role played, and I often run this role play, one person who takes absolutely opposite side on something controversial, and at the moment it could be wearing masks or being in lockdown, or should we actually have lockdown, something that's quite controversial, quite topical, and we take absolutely opposite points of view. And then we go through a process of arguing that, and quite often I'll run that as a role play with lots of pairs of people doing that. And what people usually do is, if you imagine you were down the pub with your mates and you were arguing one side or other of this argument, what you usually do is you do what Derek and I have been talking about. You're very positional. You stick to your guns, I was going to say. You stick to your guns, and you simply keep reinforcing your position. You simply keep saying why you think you're right and why you think they're wrong. And you often use lots of facts and arguments to back that up. And so the argument goes, yes, you don't listen effectively to them, and then you say yes, but, and you reinforce your position. So it's called the yes, but exercise, or the no buts exercise. And where I'm trying to get people to is to say, if you looked underneath the surface of what's actually being said, and tried to explore, why do people feel so strongly about that particular thing, whether it's mask wearing or being in lockdown or whatever, what is it they feel really strongly about, and why do they feel really strongly about it? And the next bit is to find that out, but also to reflect that back to them. So there's 3 things we're trying to do in that exercise to get people to say, I agree, or I acknowledge, or I understand. 3 things. And those words are quite magical words to say, I understand, I acknowledge, or I agree. On some aspect, something you've heard the other person say, you say, I understand, I acknowledge, or I agree. And that has a way of triggering. So what's happening in your brain all the time is you're being triggered. When you hear someone who doesn't agree with you or disagrees with you, it triggers in your brain and it makes you very defensive. And so you come back with your argument rather than thinking, actually, I can see something of what they say. So that's what's going on, is our brain's being triggered all the time when we're in argument about something we feel very serious about. So we come back at the other person instead of thinking, what could I actually say to get them a bit on my side? So using that framework, it's called the agreement frame of words, acknowledging something they've said that you either accept, understand, or agree with, and then sharing your bit, and they do the same to you. And what happens, and I've run this exercise hundreds of times now, is that over the course of the time we run the exercise, people move closer together. They were very positional, wide apart, and then they move closer together, and they start actually thinking, we may not actually agree, but we do see where the other person's coming from. And sometimes, and almost always, there's 1 or 2 couples in the room when I run these exercises who actually say, we've moved to a point where we actually agree with each other. So it's quite a magical formula, if you like, that helps people who are at opposite, diametrically opposite each other in an argument, to move together. So this kind of language, and what you see in social media and what you see in the press is a lot of inflammatory language, which makes things much more diversive. It makes people much more against each other, and that this kind of language just carries on inflaming the conflict, if you like, or the dispute, rather than moving people towards each other. So I get very frustrated when I see the kind of language and the way the press inflames it and the way social media inflames it, because the language itself can be used to help people to de-escalate the conflict. And most conflict comes out of conversation that is ineffective. So it's the conversation itself, it's the interaction between the 2 people itself which is ineffective. It's not enabling them, the way the conversation is structured, to talk about something which is difficult. And if you change the structure of the conversation, you can talk about almost anything.
Brilliant, Jane. I'd love to see you in action operating, but I don't suppose we will ever be able to see that. Jane, you've got some slides for us. Is it appropriate?
Yes.
Just to
let's have a quick look and see what we were going to talk about.
Yeah, let me just see if I can get them up properly. Is that the first slide, Jane?
That's the first slide. Yes, that's it.
Okay.
So this probably helps illustrate some of the things we've just been talking about. And this is how conflict escalates. So this is how the conversation moves from being effective to completely ineffective. So right at the beginning, people who are in conflict either stop talking to each other or their conversation becomes ineffective. So that's the stop talking phase. And people literally sort of, effectively turn their back on each other. And the next thing that happens is that they start talking to other people. And we all do this, we'll go home and talk to our partner, or we'll talk to somebody else in the office and say, you've no idea what's happening. And we have these, what I call parallel conversations. And then out of that, we create our stories. So the guy I told you about with his mates down the pub, they'd created their own stories. So we create and embroider our stories, and they keep on informing how we act. So here we are, we've gone into the yellow zone now, and then out of that come our threats and our actions. So the actions, when we're in conflict, might be that we start ignoring someone, that we start sabotaging them, that we don't reply to their emails, that we use unproductive words in our emails, or even that we actually take some action like filing a complaint or a grievance, or we issue some litigation. The interesting bit, though, is when you get into the red zone here, and this is what I find in all my conflicts and all my mediations, people have often forgot what the original conflict was about, and now it's about saving face. I don't like, so again, the guy in my mediation, he didn't want to lose face in front of his colleagues in the pub, rather than it was about, he'd forgotten what the original issue was about. Well, in fact, he hadn't, because we'd written it down in the mediation settlement agreement. But what becomes more important is the saving face. And the final stage here is actually, I think this might relate to a case you were talking about in the media, but a lot of the cases we see in the media are where people have gone to the stage where I don't care if I lose anymore, as long as I take you down with me. So what I see in commercial litigation is that people will spend an awful lot of money on legal fees, and they'll ramp up the legal fees until they really can't afford to let that go, because they've spent so much on legal fees. So maybe they've got a dispute about £50,000, but they end up, they've spent £20,000 each or more, and up it goes and up it goes, and they just keep on ramping it up because they don't want to lose. And it's all about that. And they say, I don't care anymore how much I spend, as long as I take the other person down with me. And that's a process. That's a process that many conflicts go through. I try to explain to people, once you're on the escalator, it's like being on the escalator in the department store. It's very hard to stop the escalator unless someone pushes the red button at the bottom and says, hang on, we need to stop this process and put a different process in place, which is the process of dialogue. Because this process will carry on until you get into the abyss, unless somebody takes action to stop it.
Wow, I've thought of a few things there. I mean, on Brexit, we're in that saving face situation at the moment, aren't we? The EU needs to save face, but show the electorate that they've won something.
Absolutely.
Boris needs to save face.
Yeah.
Otherwise, no deal, and that might be into the abyss. Timeouts can be very important here, can't they? And that just have a chat with someone and say, look, how much is this costing you? Yes. Or has it already come to mediation at that point? Has the lawyers' bill stopped at that point or not?
No, and one of the things I go through, which in a mediation is literally to say, how much is this costing you? But not only in terms of legal fees. So how much is it costing you in terms of your business? How much time are you taking away or not focusing? How much is it costing you in lost sleep? Because lost sleep is lost productivity, is lost effect. How much is it costing you in lost relationships? Is it damaging your relationship with your spouse, with your business colleagues? And the other thing is that how much is it costing you in your health terms? Is it impacting on your health, either now or in the long term? So mediation I was in last year, we had this thing with the legal fees ramping up, and we talked about that. And then one of the parties went quiet. I actually drew this all up on a flip chart, and he went quiet and he said, my wife's in bed at home and she's very ill, and if I spent another year on litigation, that's a year of our lives lost. So this, having this, that had a real impact on him, and he said, no, I want to settle this. And so there's lots of things when you talk about it on a practical level that need to be taken into account. And I think, again, and many people have different ideas on where we're at with lockdown, but I was just answering someone on this today. There's lots of different things to be taken into account, and lots of people with different interests. If you're a pub owner up north compared to, if you're someone who can run your business online, there's lots of different interests. both in the short term and in the long term, to be taken into account. And of course, governments and politicians and even the experts, they've put their neck on the block by saying, this is what I believe, and this is what, and we have to stick with that. And perhaps that's not right. Perhaps we need to reassess things as the situation unfolds.
Shall I go to the next slide, Jane?
Yes, sure. So this, I don't know if you use this model, Derek, but this comes really directly out of trying to model that positional versus what did we call it? Positional versus
win-win, I suppose. Win-win.
The win-win, yes.
I've not seen that model before, but I'm guessing the green zone and the red zone, but I don't understand what PIN stands for.
So PIN stands for positions. Up at the top, you've got your positions. And as I've said, in most arguments, we focus on our positions. I'm right because, and the other person says I'm right because. So in most legal cases, people would be focusing only in the red zone. And their lawyers would focus on, let's find enough facts and data and legal arguments to support that red zone. So the I and the N stand for interests and needs.
Oh, okay.
And that's all the stuff we don't talk about. So you'll remember this, Derek, from Harvard. What do I really need in this situation? What's really, really important to me? And what are my interests? So this could be all sorts of things, like what do I fundamentally need to be able to survive to next year in financial terms? What do I need to keep food on the table? What are my beliefs? What are my interests? All sorts, what are my values? All sorts of things fit into that zone that help you to understand why. So the big question there is, if you turn that up the other way, it forms a W and you say it's why. Why is that important to you? What's so important to you about that? Let me understand that. So you'll remember, Derek, probably, the case of the orange, where you say, it's well known, but if you give an orange, if you've got one orange in the fruit bowl and two kids come home from school and they're arguing about it, most parents would say, and I run this exercise most times, they'd say I would compromise. I'd cut the orange in half and I'd give half to each child. But the answer is, if you ask people why they want the orange, one might say, I wanted to make a cake or some marmalade only using the rind, and the other one might say, I simply wanted to squeeze the juice. And so when you discover why, it's possible sometimes to what we call enlarge the pie or enlarge the cake and say there is enough for everybody if we understand how we might meet people's needs and interests.
Absolutely, win-win. And I'd forgotten that orange story. I did write about it in my first book and then forgot to write about it in my last book. Interesting, that story comes up. Next slide, Jane.
So the next slide, it's just back to what I was talking about, is why do we have ineffective conversations? So what happens is that from a psychological perspective, every time we have an interaction with another person, our brain says, is this a threat or is it a benefit? Do I feel threatened, so therefore I'm going to become defensive? Or do I feel that there's some benefit to me, or the person's being nice to me and therefore I want to collaborate? So this is my 4 C's of collaboration, and we do that on 4 levels. So the first one, the first C in the middle, is connection. So my brain is saying, is this person treating me as though I am less than them, less than good than them, less qualified than them, less competent, less in a higher up? But if someone treats you as less than, smaller than, our instinct, our very primitive instinct, and I even see this in my granddaughter, who I'm learning a lot from, is to say, no, don't you treat me as less than you. And if someone treats us as not in a group or excluded from a group. The second one is about consideration. Am I being fair with someone? Am I treating them with courtesy and respect? The third one is about control. Am I trying to take control or not giving you enough control of the conversation by keeping back important information, not sharing the agenda with you, for example? And the fourth one is about caring. Am I, in the way I speak to you or the way I interact with you, showing that I'm listening and concerned? So am I showing you that you matter and I care or not? So the next circle, Derek, shows us that why we why we interact with other people, why we have conversations in the way that we individually do, is down to two things. It's down to our conditioning, how have we been brought up, what did we learn along the way, and what cultures have we been exposed to as we've gone through life, whether in our family, our schools, businesses that we've worked in. So, for example, I had one senior manager in a mediation, and he was accused of bullying. And he said to me, but that's part of the culture around here. I was bullied when I joined as a junior. It's my turn now. So sometimes we learn things through the culture we're in, and sometimes it's things that have happened to us that have conditioned us to react to other people in that way. So the final circle, Derek, is really to say all of this comes down then to consciousness, to being aware of why do I behave to other people? Why do I speak to other people in the way that I do? Because sometimes the reaction we cause in other people is not what we intended. We didn't intend to offend them, to make them defensive, but we end up having done so. So it's that level of awareness of the way I say things or how I treat someone is creating this response. It's a choice, it's something we have to be committed to, and we have to have the courage to do it, because it's perhaps a different way of relating to people than we might otherwise have done.
Very interesting, Jane. Thank you for that. And there's your book, and there's your resources up there. So
There we
anyone
are.
Screen capture
Yes.
of that, or to take a photograph of it, that's the way to do it these days. A
Yeah.
picture of that, but it will be, this video will be on YouTube anyway, so that's fantastic. Before we go to questions, I'm going to have a quick look at the questions in the chat box, but it's a question that if it is asked, what's the difference between coaching and mediation? I was puzzled by that question at the beginning, but when you've just been talking, I can see there's a huge amount of value to take somebody outside the room and give them a bit of coaching on how much they might lose if they keep fighting this battle, or
yeah, that's a good question, Derek, because I think, as you say, sometimes coaching would be part of what I do. I would be coaching someone through their negotiation process. I suppose in mediation, you've got an actual conflict between two parties or more than two parties, whereas in coaching, you're dealing one-to-one with another person. Some of the principles that we use are very similar. So, helping people to listen, helping people to understand themselves. Some of the basic skills, the listening and the reflecting and so on, are skills that coaches would use, but we're using them in the context of two or more people in a live process together.
And if it goes on to ask, is it saving face by keeping your head down, a way to de-escalate a situation?
Yes, I think sometimes understanding when to back away from something is important. And sometimes saving face can simply be, I'm not going to plow on with this. I'll step back, or I'll step back for now. And I think, I think sometimes we are all tempted to keep proving that we're right and keep pushing forward. And sometimes taking a step back, even temporarily, can be a good thing to do.
Yeah, and one last question from me, unless there's anything else coming into the chat box, and then we'll close the recording down. And if you'll stay on for a little while, Jane, and answer any other questions, that would be fantastic. Going through my brain here, emotional intelligence, sensory acuity was coming into it. I can see some people not being very emotionally intelligent in some of these mediations, and somehow you need to make them think about that. How would you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Obviously, it's not a coaching situation, so I don't have long. If somebody comes in and they're not very emotionally intelligent, I'm not going to transform that. Having said that, though, sometimes people do have light bulb moments and they suddenly see things from a different perspective. And I can remember, in particular, one quite emotional workplace mediation where there was an insurance company, there was quite a big company represented on one side. Somebody made a statement, so the party who had been made redundant or whatever, had lost his job, made a statement, and it was so powerful that it actually pricked tears in most people's eyes. And the other party, the big company with the insurance company behind them, said, I'd like a moment, if you wouldn't mind. I'd like to write and read a reply to that. So he went away, hand wrote a reply to that, and insisted on reading it out in front of all of us, which was a very powerful thing to do. And again, it was acknowledging, the trauma that this person had been through in the events that led up to the dispute. So sometimes people suddenly do realize that becoming human and relating to the human being and the other is what's needed, and that when you do that, that can be part of what was wanted all along.
That sounds very powerful indeed, Jane. We have
Mm.
no more questions in the chat box, so
Mm.
Jane, I would just like to thank you once again for coming on the second time. It's absolutely brilliant. If we keep this going, and I'm sure we will, lots of people lined up. We'd like to invite you back again in the new year. I know that your website's www.janegunn.com, and people can find you on the internet and send you any questions, because you and I believe in abundance and sharing. And anybody watching this on YouTube, thanks for joining us. Jane and I share a passion for win-win negotiating, win-win mediation, and stopping people getting in too many disputes. So you can watch this on YouTube, or you can listen to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. This is Derek Arden.